The gunfire echoed through Serpent's canyon like thunder trapped between stone walls. Captain Elena Vasquez pressed herself against the cold granite, counting muzzle flashes in the darkness above. 47 enemy positions, maybe 50. Her earpiece crackled with desperate voices. 200 soldiers from the 118th Mountain Infantry Division pinned down in a kill zone that should have been impossible to escape. 3 hours until dawn. 3 hours before enemy reinforcements would arrive and turn this rescue mission into a massacre. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena closed her eyes and did something that had once cost her everything. She let herself feel the weight of 200 lives pressing against her chest, the terror in young voices calling for help over the radio, the rage at commanders who had sent good soldiers into a trap. 5 years ago, these emotions had been called her weakness. Tonight, they would become her greatest weapon. But to understand how Elena Vasquez came to be crouched in a canyon at 3 a.m., ready to attempt the impossible, we need to go back to where it all began, in a place where emotion was supposed to be buried deep and military precision was supposed to rule everything. Millfield, Montana existed in the kind of silence that only mountain towns knew how to keep. Nestled between pine-covered peaks and valleys carved by ancient glaciers, it was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone's business, except when someone worked very hard to keep their business unknown. Elena Vasquez had been working at that particular skill for exactly 5 years, 2 months, and 16 days. She stood behind the counter of Mountain Edge Outfitters, watching snow fall past the window in lazy spirals that reminded her of parachute drops she wasn't supposed to remember. The outdoor gear store smelled of canvas and leather, honest materials for honest people living honest lives. It was nothing like the sterile corridors of Forward Operating Base Ironclad, where she'd once walked with the confident stride of someone who believed the uniform made them invincible. The bell above the door chimed as old Pete Kowalski shuffled in, bringing with him the scent of coffee and the morning gossip that fueled small-town conversations. Pete was 73, had served 2 tours in Vietnam, and possessed the uncanny ability to spot military bearing from 50 yards in a blizzard. "Morning, Elena," he said, settling onto the stool by the register with the careful movements of someone whose joints remembered wars fought decades ago. "Heard they're calling for another storm this weekend. Might want to stock up on those emergency shelters." Elena nodded, already pulling inventory sheets from beneath the counter. Her movements were economical, precise, the kind of efficiency that came from years of training that emphasized wasting nothing, especially time. Pete noticed, the way he always noticed, but he'd learned not to ask direct questions about the woman who'd appeared in Millfield with cash for a down payment, references that checked out perfectly, and eyes that had seen too much for someone who claimed to have spent her 20s managing outdoor recreation programs in Colorado. "You know," Pete continued, accepting the coffee Elena poured from the pot she kept behind the counter, "my grandson Kyle is shipping out next month. Marines. Kid's eager as a hunting dog in duck season. Thinks he's gonna save the world." Elena's hand paused for just a fraction of a second as she reached for her own mug. It was a tell so small that most people would miss it, but Pete had spent 50 years reading people the way other folks read newspapers. "He'll do fine," Elena said, her voice carrying the even tone of someone who'd had practice delivering news to families, both good and bad. "Marines know how to take care of their own." "That's what I keep telling his mother," Pete replied, though she worries he's too soft-hearted for the military. "Kid cried when our old dog died last summer. Spent 3 days building a proper grave marker. His drill instructor's been trying to toughen him up, but Kyle keeps writing letters home about wanting to help people instead of hurt them." Elena set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary, the ceramic clicking against the wooden counter like a small gunshot. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Pain, recognition, anger, before the careful mask slipped back into place. "Soft-hearted doesn't mean weak," she said quietly. "Sometimes it means you understand what you're really fighting for." Pete studied her profile as she turned to organize a display of hiking boots that were already perfectly arranged. Elena Vasquez was 34 years old, though she carried herself with the bearing of someone both older and younger. older in the weight she carried behind green eyes that seemed to catalog every exit and potential threat in any room she entered, younger in the way she sometimes paused to watch children play in the park across from her store, as if remembering something she'd lost. She was beautiful in the way that mountains were beautiful, not soft or decorative, but carved by elements that demanded respect. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a functional ponytail, and she wore the same uniform every day: jeans, boots, and flannel shirts, in colors that wouldn't show dirt or blood. The only jewelry she wore was a simple silver chain that disappeared beneath her collar, holding something she never showed to anyone. The people of Millfield had theories, of course. Small towns ran on speculation the way cars ran on gasoline. Some whispered that she'd been married to a soldier who died overseas, that she'd moved to Montana to escape the memories. Others suspected she was running from an abusive relationship, noting the way she automatically scanned rooms and positioned herself near exits. The romantically inclined believed she was waiting for someone to come back from deployment, explaining why she never dated despite the attention from several local men who found her combination of competence and mystery irresistible. What they didn't know was that Elena Vasquez had been dead for 5 years. Officially, according to military records that were buried deeper than most state secrets, Captain Elena Vasquez had suffered a complete psychological breakdown following a training incident at Pine Valley Training Facility. She'd been quietly discharged, her records sealed, her security clearances revoked. The woman who ran Mountain Edge Outfitters was someone else entirely. Someone who'd never held a commission, never led soldiers into combat, never made the kind of mistakes that ended careers and destroyed lives. The truth was more complicated, the way truth usually was when it involved classified operations and military politics that reduced human lives to acceptable losses and strategic considerations. Elena had been one of the youngest officers ever selected for Raven Squadron, an elite tactical unit that specialized in high-altitude mountain warfare and behind-enemy lines operations. She'd earned her position through exceptional performance in every metric the military valued: marksmanship, tactical planning, physical conditioning, leadership under pressure. Her downfall had been something the military didn't know how to measure. She cared too much. It started with small things that her superiors chose to overlook, because her results were undeniable. Elena knew the names of every soldier under her command, their families, their fears, their dreams beyond military service. She spent her own money on care packages for troops whose families couldn't afford to send them. She wrote personal letters to the parents of soldiers who died under her command. Letters that went far beyond the standard military notification and actually helped people grieve. Her fellow officers called it emotional intelligence, and some of them envied her ability to inspire absolute loyalty in her troops. Elena's soldiers would follow her anywhere, not because they feared her authority, but because they trusted her to value their lives as much as she valued the mission. In an era of military leadership that emphasized efficiency over empathy, Elena had found a way to be both effective and human. The problems began when she started questioning orders that seemed designed to get good people killed for questionable strategic gains. Elena had a dangerous habit of asking why certain missions were necessary, whether the intelligence was reliable, if there were alternatives that might achieve the same objectives with fewer casualties. She submitted detailed reports suggesting modifications to tactics that prioritized soldier safety without compromising mission effectiveness. Her commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Reed, was a career soldier who'd climbed the ranks by never questioning orders and never acknowledging that the people under his command were anything more than resources to be deployed. Reed had earned his position through political connections and an ability to deliver results that looked good in briefings, regardless of the human cost. He viewed Elena's emotional investment in her soldiers as a dangerous weakness that threatened the chain of command. The confrontation that ended Elena's military career happened on a cold Tuesday morning in the briefing room at Pine Valley Training Facility. Reed had just finished outlining a training exercise that Elena recognized as fundamentally flawed, a simulation designed to test soldiers' ability to follow orders under extreme stress, even when those orders seemed to guarantee casualties. "Sir," Elena had said, raising her hand with the respectful formality that military protocol demanded, "I've identified several modifications to this exercise that would maintain the training value while reducing unnecessary risk to personnel." Reed's expression had hardened immediately. "Captain Vasquez, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The purpose of this exercise is to prepare soldiers for combat situations where perfect safety isn't an option. War doesn't offer modifications for comfort. Respectfully, sir, this isn't about comfort. It's about not training our people to accept preventable deaths as inevitable. The enemy will try to kill them. We shouldn't. The room had gone silent with the particular kind of quiet that preceded career-ending moments. Elena could feel the tension radiating from the other officers present, their discomfort at watching someone challenge Reed's authority in front of witnesses. "Captain," Reed had said, his voice carrying the icy precision of someone delivering a final warning, "your emotional attachment to your soldiers is compromising your judgment. A good officer understands that some casualties are acceptable if they serve the greater strategic purpose." Elena had stood up then, her chair scraping against the floor in the silence. "Sir, with respect, there's nothing acceptable about preventable casualties. Every soldier under our command is someone's child, someone's future. Our job is to complete the mission and bring them home. If we can't do both, we need better missions or better planning." Reed's face had flushed red with anger at being contradicted so directly. "You're too emotional for command, Captain. You care more about being liked than being effective. That kind of weakness gets people killed in real combat." "The only thing that gets people killed," Elena had replied, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest, "is leaders who forget that statistics have names and families and futures that matter." The formal reprimand had come down 3 days later. Elena was removed from command of Raven Squadron and assigned to administrative duties pending a psychological evaluation. The evaluation, conducted by military psychiatrists who understood which conclusions would advance their careers, found that Captain Elena Vasquez suffered from excessive emotional involvement with subordinates and inability to maintain appropriate professional distance required for command decisions. Elena had been given a choice: accept reassignment to a desk job in military logistics, or accept a medical discharge with full benefits and a service record that would be classified to protect sensitive operational details. She'd chosen the discharge, understanding that her military career was over either way, but hoping that leaving quietly might protect the soldiers she'd tried to defend. The woman who walked out of Pine Valley Training Facility bore little resemblance to the officer who'd entered. Elena had spent 15 years building her identity around military service, believing that the uniform gave her purpose, and the rank gave her the authority to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Without them, she felt hollow, purposeless, adrift in a civilian world that seemed impossibly soft after years of military precision. She drifted for 6 months, staying in cheap motels and working temporary jobs that required no background checks and few questions. The nightmares came regularly, not of combat she'd experienced, but of all the soldiers she'd failed to protect by not fighting harder against a system that treated them as expendable. Elena would wake up remembering faces from her command, wondering which of them were still alive, still serving under officers who saw them as numbers on casualty reports rather than human beings deserving of protection. Millfield had been a random choice, a dot on a map where she'd stopped for gas and stayed, because the mountains reminded her of training exercises when everything had seemed clear and purposeful. She'd used the money from her discharge settlement to buy the outdoor equipment store, creating a new identity as carefully as she'd once planned military operations. Elena Torres became Elena Vasquez through paperwork that was legal but not entirely honest, building a cover story that would satisfy casual curiosity without inviting deeper investigation. For 5 years, she'd maintained the fiction perfectly. She sold hiking gear to tourists and hunting equipment to locals, offering advice drawn from experience she couldn't acknowledge and skills she couldn't explain. Elena had found a kind of peace in the simplicity of civilian life, in problems that could be solved with the right gear and honest work, rather than violence and tactical calculations. But peace, Elena had learned, was always temporary for people who'd seen too much and cared too deeply. The skills that had made her an exceptional military officer, situational awareness, tactical thinking, ability to read people and predict their actions, didn't simply disappear because she'd traded her uniform for flannel shirts. She noticed things that others missed, patterns that suggested problems brewing beneath Millfield's calm surface. Like the fact that Pete Kowalski's grandson Kyle had been writing letters that mentioned classified training exercises he shouldn't have known about. Or that 3 different customers in the past month had come in asking about cold weather gear suitable for operations in mountainous terrain, paying in cash and avoiding eye contact when she asked about their specific needs. Small details that might mean nothing, or might mean that the life she'd built in Montana was about to collide with the world she'd tried to leave behind. Elena finished organizing the boot display and returned to the counter where Pete was reading a newspaper with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to look for important information between the lines of official stories. "Says here they're doing more training exercises up in the Copper Ridge area," Pete commented, folding the paper to show Elena the small article buried on page 4. "Military's been pretty active lately, helicopters flying over at all hours. Folks are starting to wonder what they're practicing for." Elena read the article quickly, her trained eye catching details that the casual reader would miss. The exercises were described as routine mountain warfare training, but the timing and location suggested something more urgent. Copper Ridge was strategic terrain, the kind of place where you'd train soldiers for specific operational environments rather than general preparedness. "Probably just keeping skills sharp," Elena said, handing the paper back to Pete. "Military likes to train in different terrain. Keeps the troops flexible." Pete studied her face with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades learning to read between the lines of official explanations. "You know, Elena, in all the time you've been here, you've never talked much about what you did before moving to Montana. Folks respect your privacy, but sometimes a person can't help wondering." Elena met his gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying the suspicion she could see in his weathered features. "Sometimes the past is better left in the past, Pete. Especially when the present is working out just fine." Before Pete could respond, the bell above the door chimed again, admitting a blast of cold air and a young man in civilian clothes who moved with the particular combination of confidence and nervous energy that Elena recognized immediately. Military, probably junior enlisted, trying very hard to look like a regular customer, while simultaneously cataloging everything in the store that might be useful for tactical operations. The young man was maybe 22. With the kind of short haircut that suggested recent military service, and the pale complexion of someone who'd been spending too much time indoors. He wore jeans and a hiking jacket that were obviously new, purchased specifically for this visit, rather than from any genuine interest in outdoor recreation. "Can I help you find something?" Elena asked, slipping automatically into the customer service role that had become her primary cover identity. "Yes, ma'am," the young man replied, his formality confirming Elena's assessment of his background. "I'm looking for cold weather gear. High-altitude stuff for, hiking. In winter conditions." Elena nodded pleasantly while her mind cataloged the tells that suggested this was anything but a casual shopping trip. The way his eyes swept the store's layout, noting exits and sightlines. The way he positioned himself to keep both Elena and Pete in view while maintaining clear access to the door. The fact that he'd asked for high-altitude gear in November, when any experienced hiker would know that the serious mountain routes were already closed for the season. "What kind of altitude are we talking about?" Elena asked, moving toward the display of insulated clothing. "And what's the temperature range you're expecting?" The young man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with questions that required him to elaborate on his cover story. "Well, probably pretty high. And cold. Really cold. Like survival conditions." Elena selected a heavy-duty parka and held it up for inspection, using the movement to get a better look at her customer. He was nervous but determined, the kind of nervous that came from being asked to do something important and dangerous by people he couldn't disappoint. Elena recognized the expression from her years of command. It was the look of a young soldier who'd been given a mission he didn't fully understand, but was determined to complete anyway. "This is rated for -40 degrees, Elena said, her voice maintaining the helpful tone of a shopkeeper, while her instincts screamed that this was about more than outdoor gear. "But if you're planning serious high-altitude work, you'll need more than just a coat. Layering system, proper boots, emergency shelter, navigation equipment. Winter mountains don't forgive mistakes." The young man nodded eagerly, pulling out a notebook to write down her recommendations. "Yeah, that sounds right. What about, group gear? For multiple people?" Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always preceded moments when her past threatened to surface. "How many people?" "A lot," he said, then caught himself. "I mean, a good-sized group. For a club. A hiking club." Pete had been listening to the conversation with the interest of someone who'd heard his share of cover stories, and Elena could feel his attention like a weight pressing against her shoulders. She needed to handle this carefully, gather information without revealing too much about her own knowledge or capabilities. "Group expeditions require careful planning," Elena said, pulling out a laminated checklist she kept for serious customers. "Weather monitoring, communication equipment, medical supplies, emergency evacuation procedures. Winter mountains are unforgiving, especially if something goes wrong." The young man's eyes lit up at the mention of evacuation procedures, confirming Elena's growing suspicion that this wasn't about hiking. That's exactly what we need to know about. Evacuation. Getting people out of difficult terrain. Elena set down the checklist and looked directly at her customer. "Son, I think we need to have a more honest conversation about what you're really planning." The young man's face went pale, and Elena could see him trying to decide between maintaining his cover story and asking for the help he obviously needed. Pete cleared his throat and stood up from his stool, moving toward the door with the deliberate steps of someone who understood when discretion was called for. "I'll be over at the diner if you need me, Elena," Pete said, pausing at the door. Sometimes a man's got to know when a conversation isn't meant for his ears. After Pete left, Elena locked the door and flipped the sign to "Closed," then turned back to the young man who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "What's your name?" Elena asked, her voice dropping the customer service cheerfulness and taking on the tone of authority she'd once used to command soldiers. "Dylan," he replied, automatically straightening his posture in response to Elena's change in demeanor. "Dylan Cross." "And you're military, probably Army, based on your bearing, probably stationed somewhere within driving distance of Millfield." Elena moved behind the counter, putting physical distance between them while maintaining eye contact. "The question is whether you're here officially, or because someone sent you to find help that doesn't officially exist." Dylan's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air, clearly unprepared for Elena's direct approach. "Ma'am, I can't talk about classified operations, can't reveal sensitive information, can't admit that you're looking for someone with specific skills that the regular military doesn't want to acknowledge." Elena finished the sentence for him, recognizing the familiar paralysis of a soldier caught between conflicting orders and desperate circumstances. "How did you—" Dylan stopped himself, but Elena could see the recognition dawning in his eyes as he processed her knowledge of military protocols and classified operations. Elena walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered street, watching for any signs that Dylan hadn't come alone. There are only a few reasons why a young soldier would drive to Montana looking for high-altitude cold-weather gear in November, spinning stories about hiking clubs and evacuation procedures. Either you're planning something incredibly stupid, or someone you care about is in trouble and the official channels aren't helping. Dylan was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that his next words might have consequences beyond his ability to control. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet desperation of someone who'd run out of alternatives. "There are people trapped," he said. "Good people. And the brass is saying they're expendable, that the mission parameters don't allow for extraction. But that's not right. That's not what we're supposed to do." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach, the familiar sensation of watching history repeat itself with different players, but the same fundamental failure of leadership. "How many people?" 200, Dylan whispered. 200 soldiers from the 118th Mountain Infantry Division. They were sent into Copper Ridge for what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. But something went wrong. They're pinned down in Serpent's Canyon with hostile forces on all sides, and Command is calling it an acceptable loss for the greater good of the operation. The words hit Elena like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about the military culture she'd tried to escape. 200 soldiers, young men and women who'd trusted their leaders to value their lives, were being written off as statistics to protect someone's career or political agenda. "Who sent you to find me?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dylan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn from handling and obviously read many times. Major Catherine Romano. She said if anything ever went really wrong, if the system failed the way it sometimes fails, I should find Elena Vasquez in Millfield, Montana. She said you'd understand what needs to be done. Elena took the paper with hands that trembled slightly as she recognized Kit Romano's handwriting. Kit had been her second-in-command in Raven Squadron, one of the few officers who'd supported Elena's emotional approach to leadership and paid the price for that loyalty. The note was brief but comprehensive, providing Dylan with enough information to find her while avoiding any details that would compromise security if the message was intercepted. Elena, the note read, if Dylan is reading this to you, then the thing we always feared has happened. Good soldiers are dying because bad leaders are making decisions based on politics instead of people. You once told me that our job was to complete the mission and bring everyone home. I still believe that's possible, even when the people in charge have given up. The choice is yours, but you're the only person I trust to make it right. Kit. Elena folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket, feeling the weight of old promises and new responsibilities settling across her shoulders like a familiar uniform. For 5 years, she'd told herself that her military career was over, that she'd found peace in civilian life and wouldn't be drawn back into the world of tactical decisions and life-or-death leadership. But 200 soldiers were trapped in a canyon, and their commanding officers had decided they were expendable. Elena had spent 5 years trying to forget what it felt like to be responsible for other people's lives, but the memory was too strong and the need too urgent to ignore. She looked at Dylan, seeing her younger self in his combination of determination and fear, and made a decision that would end her quiet life in Montana and resurrect a version of herself she'd thought was buried forever. Tell me everything, Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was no longer pretending to be a civilian shopkeeper. And then we're going to figure out how to bring those soldiers home. Dylan spread the tactical maps across Elena's counter with the careful precision of someone who'd memorized every detail but still needed to see the bigger picture laid out in front of him. The satellite imagery showed Serpent's Canyon in stark black and white, a narrow gorge carved through the Copper Ridge Mountains like a scar across the landscape. Elena studied the terrain with eyes that automatically calculated firing angles, defensive positions, and escape routes, skills that had never really gone dormant despite 5 years of civilian life. The 118th was supposed to be conducting a standard winter warfare exercise, Dylan explained, his finger tracing the canyon's serpentine path. Small unit tactics, cold weather survival, mountain navigation. Nothing that should have required more than basic safety protocols. Elena leaned closer to examine the topographical details, noting the canyon's depth and the limited access points that made it both strategically valuable and tactically dangerous. What changed? Dylan pulled out a second set of documents, these bearing classification stamps that made Elena's pulse quicken despite herself. Intelligence reports started coming in 3 days ago. Armed hostiles had moved into the area, using the canyon system to smuggle weapons and personnel across the border. Command decided to modify the training exercise into a reconnaissance mission. Without proper preparation or briefing, Elena said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who'd seen this pattern before. They sent soldiers trained for exercises into an active combat zone. Major Romano protested the mission parameters, Dylan continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She said the intelligence was unreliable, that the soldiers weren't equipped or briefed for actual combat operations. Colonel Reed overruled her objections and ordered the mission to proceed as planned. Elena felt a familiar burning in her chest at the mention of Reed's name. 5 years hadn't diminished her anger at the man who'd ended her career for caring too much about the people under her command. Now Reed was making the same mistakes that had driven Elena from military service, treating soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving of protection. What's the current situation? Elena asked, forcing herself to focus on immediate tactical concerns rather than past grievances. Dylan unfolded a real-time intelligence report that showed the devastating scope of the disaster Reed's decisions had created. The 118th entered Serpent's Canyon at 0600 hours yesterday morning. They were supposed to conduct a sweep and extract by 1800 hours, but the hostiles were waiting for them. Well-positioned, well-armed, and obviously informed about the military's plans. Elena studied the enemy positions marked on the tactical overlay, her mind automatically analyzing the ambush from a professional perspective. The attack had been expertly planned, with overlapping fields of fire that turned the narrow canyon into a kill zone. Whoever had orchestrated this operation possessed sophisticated military knowledge and had clearly received advance intelligence about American troop movements. "It's a classic pincer movement," Elena observed, tracing the enemy positions with her finger. "They let the soldiers get deep into the canyon, then closed off the entrance and exit points. Perfect tactical setup, except for one problem. They didn't account for winter weather patterns in this region." Dylan looked confused, clearly not understanding the significance of Elena's observation. "What do you mean?" Elena walked to her computer and pulled up meteorological data for the Copper Ridge area, displaying wind patterns and storm systems that most people would dismiss as routine weather information. To someone with Elena's training, however, the data revealed tactical opportunities that could turn a hopeless situation into a rescue operation. "There's a major storm system moving through the region over the next 48 hours, Elena explained, highlighting wind speeds and precipitation patterns. "Visibility will drop to near zero, temperatures will fall below -30 degrees, and the wind patterns will create acoustic shadows that can mask aircraft movement." "I still don't understand how that helps," Dylan admitted. "Wouldn't bad weather make a rescue operation more dangerous?" Elena smiled for the first time since Dylan had entered her store, the expression carrying equal parts determination and anticipation. "Bad weather makes everything more dangerous, which is exactly why conventional military thinking avoids it. But if you're willing to operate in conditions that your enemy considers impossible, you gain tactical advantages that can offset their numerical superiority." She pulled out a detailed topographical map of the entire Copper Ridge region, spreading it alongside the canyon imagery to show the broader strategic picture. Elena's finger traced alternative routes through the mountain terrain, paths that didn't appear on standard military maps but offered possibilities for unconventional approaches. "The hostiles are positioned to defend against standard military tactics, helicopter insertions, ground assaults through the main access points, coordinated attacks from multiple directions," Elena continued. "But they're not prepared for someone crazy enough to attempt a rescue operation in the middle of a blizzard using routes that officially don't exist." Dylan studied the maps with growing understanding, beginning to see the tactical picture that Elena was painting. "You're talking about going in alone, in weather that could kill you before you even reach the canyon." "Not alone," Elena corrected. "You're going to help me, along with anyone else who's willing to prioritize soldiers' lives over military politics." Dylan's face went pale as he realized the implications of what Elena was suggesting. "Ma'am, I can't authorize an unauthorized rescue operation. I'm just a sergeant. I don't have the authority to countermand direct orders from Colonel Reed." Elena looked directly into Dylan's eyes, her expression carrying the intensity of someone who'd made similar decisions under pressure and understood the weight of choosing between official orders and moral obligations. "Dylan, in about 6 hours, those 200 soldiers are going to start dying from hypothermia and enemy fire. In 12 hours, the storm will make any rescue attempt impossible until spring. Colonel Reed has already written them off as acceptable casualties." She paused, letting the reality of the situation settle in Dylan's mind before continuing. "The question isn't whether you have the authority to countermand Reed's orders. The question is whether you can live with yourself if you don't try to save people who are depending on someone, anyone, to remember that their lives matter." Dylan was quiet for several minutes, staring at the maps while wrestling with the kind of decision that would define the rest of his military career and personal conscience. Elena recognized the internal struggle from her own experience, the moment when a soldier had to choose between the safety of following orders and the risk of doing what was right. "What would you need from me?" Dylan finally asked, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who'd already made his decision but needed to understand the consequences. Elena began gathering the maps and documents, her movements efficient and purposeful as she shifted from analysis mode into operational planning. "First, I need you to contact Major Romano and anyone else in the chain of command who might be willing to provide unofficial support. Not authorization, that's not going to happen, but intelligence updates, equipment access, and communication relay." Dylan nodded, pulling out his encrypted satellite phone to send coded messages that would alert Elena's potential allies without explicitly acknowledging what they were planning. "What else?" "Second, I need detailed information about the soldiers who are trapped." Not just numbers and unit designations, but names, specializations, medical conditions, anything that might affect their ability to survive or assist in their own rescue. Elena moved to a locked cabinet behind the counter and began removing equipment that Dylan suddenly realized had nothing to do with civilian outdoor recreation. The gear Elena unpacked included military-grade communication devices, specialized navigation equipment, and survival tools that were designed for operations in extreme environments. Dylan watched with growing amazement as the woman he'd thought of as a civilian shopkeeper revealed herself to be someone with access to equipment and expertise that rivaled anything the regular military possessed. Third, Elena continued, checking the battery levels on her equipment. I need you to establish a communication schedule that will allow me to coordinate with anyone who's in position to provide support without revealing operational details that could compromise the mission if the communications are intercepted. Dylan was taking notes frantically, trying to keep up with Elena's rapid transition from cautious civilian to operational military planner. How do you have all this equipment? And how do you know so much about military communications protocols? Elena paused in her preparations and looked at Dylan with an expression that carried years of carefully guarded secrets. Because 5 years ago I was Captain Elena Vasquez, commanding officer of Raven Squadron, and I was relieved of command for caring too much about the soldiers under my authority. Tonight, I'm going to prove that caring too much is exactly what those trapped soldiers need. The revelation hit Dylan like a physical blow as he realized that he'd found exactly the person Major Romano had sent him to locate. Elena Vasquez wasn't just someone with military experience. She was a legend, one of the officers whose tactical innovations and leadership style had become the subject of whispered conversations in military academies and training facilities. "You're the Elena Vasquez," Dylan said, his voice filled with awe. "The officer who led the extraction at Devil's Ridge, who brought out 40 soldiers from an impossible situation with 0 casualties." Elena's expression hardened slightly at the mention of her past successes, memories that carried both pride and pain. "I'm also the officer who was deemed too emotional for command because I refused to accept preventable casualties as the cost of doing business. The same emotional attachment that ended my career is going to save those soldiers if you're willing to help me." Dylan straightened his posture, his decision crystallizing into the kind of resolve that separated good soldiers from great ones. "Ma'am, what are your orders?" Elena smiled again, this time with the warmth of recognition and approval. "First, we establish communications with Major Romano and anyone else who's in position to provide support. Then we gather intelligence about the enemy positions and the condition of our trapped soldiers. Finally, we plan an approach that uses the incoming storm as cover for an operation that conventional military wisdom would consider impossible." Over the next 2 hours, Elena's outdoor equipment store was transformed into an operational command center that would have impressed professional military planners. Dylan established encrypted communications with a network of officers who shared Elena's philosophy about prioritizing soldiers' lives over political considerations. Major Romano responded immediately, providing detailed intelligence about the trapped soldiers and the enemy forces surrounding them. The situation was worse than Dylan's initial reports had indicated. The 118th Mountain Infantry Division wasn't just pinned down. They were systematically being eliminated by an enemy force that possessed sophisticated military equipment and tactical knowledge. The hostiles had night vision capabilities, advanced weaponry, and communication systems that allowed them to coordinate attacks with professional precision. "This isn't a random group of smugglers or local militants," Elena observed, studying the intelligence reports that Major Romano had transmitted. "Someone with serious military training planned and executed this ambush. The positioning is too perfect, the equipment too advanced, the tactics too sophisticated for anything except a professional military operation." Dylan looked up from the communication logs he'd been reviewing, his expression troubled by implications he was beginning to understand. "Major Romano thinks there might be a leak in the command structure. Someone with access to classified mission parameters provided the enemy with advanced intelligence about the 118th's movements." Elena felt the familiar, cold certainty that accompanied the recognition of betrayal within military ranks. "Reed?" she said simply, the name carrying all the contempt and anger she'd accumulated over 5 years of forced civilian life. "You think Colonel Reed is working with the enemy?" Dylan asked, clearly struggling to accept the possibility of such fundamental treachery. "I think Reed is working for Reed," Elena replied, pulling up personnel files that showed the colonel's career trajectory and financial records. "He's positioning himself for promotion to general, and that requires eliminating anyone who might testify about his history of sacrificing soldiers for political gain. What better way to silence potential witnesses than to send them into an ambush that's been disguised as a training accident?" The scope of Reed's betrayal became clearer as Elena and Dylan analyzed the pattern of training accidents and operational casualties that had occurred under his command over the past 2 years. Soldiers who had served under Elena's leadership, who knew about her dismissal and Reed's role in destroying her career, had been systematically assigned to high-risk operations with suspicious casualty rates. "He's been cleaning house," Elena realized, her voice carrying the cold fury of someone who understood that her former soldiers had been murdered to protect Reed's career. "Every soldier who served under my command, who might remember that there was an alternative to Reed's approach to leadership, has been eliminated or assigned to operations designed to get them killed." Dylan stared at the evidence with horror, finally understanding the full scope of what they were facing. The 118th isn't just trapped by enemy forces, they're trapped by their own commanding officer who wants them dead. Elena stood up and began putting on the cold weather gear she'd selected for the rescue operation, her movements deliberate and purposeful as she prepared for a mission that would either save 200 soldiers or add her name to the list of Reed's victims. "Which is exactly why we're not going to rely on official channels or wait for authorization from command," Elena said, checking her equipment one final time. "We're going to do what good soldiers have always done when their leaders fail them. We're going to take care of each other." Dylan watched Elena's transformation from civilian shopkeeper to military operator with fascination and growing confidence. This was the person Major Romano had described, the officer whose emotional investment in her soldiers had made her both an exceptional leader and a threat to commanders who preferred treating troops as expendable resources. "What's the plan?" Dylan asked, ready to follow Elena into whatever hell awaited them in Serpent's Canyon. Elena spread out the final tactical map, showing the route she'd planned through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain warfare specialists. "We're going to do something that Reed's tactical manual says is impossible. We're going to extract 200 soldiers from a defended position in the middle of a blizzard, using nothing but determination and the kind of emotional investment in their welfare that got me kicked out of the military." She traced the insertion route with her finger, explaining how they would use the storm's cover to approach the canyon from an angle that the enemy wouldn't expect and couldn't effectively defend. "The hostiles are positioned to repel conventional rescue attempts, but they're not prepared for someone who's willing to rappel down a frozen waterfall in sub-zero temperatures while carrying enough firepower to suppress their positions." Dylan studied the route with growing amazement and terror. "Ma'am, that approach is going to require climbing skills, cold weather survival expertise, and tactical knowledge that goes way beyond standard military training." Elena shouldered her pack and headed toward the store's rear exit, where her modified vehicle waited in the darkness. "Lucky for those soldiers, I've spent the last 5 years preparing for the possibility that someday I might need to prove that caring too much about people's lives isn't a weakness. It's the only thing that really matters." As they stepped into the Montana night, Elena felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling across her shoulders like armor. For 5 years, she'd convinced herself that her military career was over, that she'd found peace in civilian life, and wouldn't be drawn back into the world of tactical decisions and life-or-death leadership. But 200 soldiers were counting on someone to remember that their lives had value beyond strategic calculations and political considerations. Elena had been dismissed from military service for refusing to accept that good people were expendable, and tonight she was going to prove that her emotional investment in soldiers' welfare was exactly what they needed to survive. The storm was building on the horizon, bringing with it the kind of weather that would ground conventional aircraft and force rational military planners to wait for better conditions. Elena smiled as she started her vehicle, knowing that rational military planning was exactly what had gotten those soldiers trapped in the first place. Sometimes the only rational response to an irrational situation was to do something that everyone else considered impossible. Elena had been preparing for this moment for 5 years, and she was finally ready to show the military establishment that caring too much about soldiers' lives wasn't a weakness. It was the most powerful weapon an officer could possess. The drive through the Montana wilderness tested both Elena's modified vehicle and her resolve as the storm system moved in faster than the meteorological reports had predicted. Snow whipped across the windshield in sheets that made navigation treacherous, while the wind howled through the mountain passes with a ferocity that promised to ground any aircraft foolish enough to attempt flight in these conditions. Elena gripped the steering wheel with hands that remembered similar drives during classified operations, when weather became an ally to those willing to embrace its dangers. Dylan sat in the passenger seat monitoring encrypted communications traffic, his face illuminated by the green glow of military-grade equipment that painted shadows across his features. The radio chatter painted a grim picture of the situation developing in Serpent's Canyon, with updates from Major Romano confirming Elena's worst fears about the sophistication of the enemy forces and the deteriorating condition of the trapped soldiers. Temperature dropped another 15 degrees in the last hour, Dylan reported, his voice barely audible over the wind battering the vehicle. Major Romano says hypothermia cases are mounting among the 118th. They're burning through their emergency fuel supplies trying to stay warm, and medical supplies are running critically low. Elena adjusted her driving to compensate for a particularly vicious crosswind that threatened to push them off the narrow mountain road. What about enemy activity? Dylan consulted his tactical display, watching real-time intelligence updates that painted an increasingly desperate picture. Hostiles are maintaining their positions around the canyon perimeter, but they're also being affected by the weather. Thermal imaging shows they've pulled back from some of the more exposed positions to avoid frostbite, which might give us small windows of opportunity. Elena processed this information while navigating a series of switchbacks that descended toward the Copper Ridge area, her mind automatically calculating how weather conditions would affect both enemy capabilities and her own operational options. The storm was simultaneously her greatest asset and most dangerous obstacle, providing concealment while threatening to kill everyone involved if they made tactical mistakes. "Any word from higher command about official rescue operations?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dylan's expression darkened as he read through the latest communications from military headquarters. Colonel Reed issued a statement classifying the situation as a training exercise that encountered unexpected difficulties. He's ordered all personnel to maintain operational security and avoid discussing the matter with unauthorized individuals. Translation: He's covering his tracks while good soldiers die, Elena said, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd seen this pattern before. What about casualty reports? Officially, there are no casualties because officially nothing is happening. Dylan replied, his disgust evident in every word. Unofficially, Major Romano estimates they've lost at least 12 soldiers to enemy fire and hypothermia, with dozens more in critical condition. Elena felt each reported death like a physical blow, remembering faces from her years of command and knowing that some of those casualties were soldiers she'd once led, trained, and promised to bring home safely. Reed's betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal, targeting people whose only crime had been serving under an officer who cared more about their welfare than political advancement. The vehicle's GPS system chimed softly as they approached the coordinates Elena had selected for their insertion point, a location that offered concealment while providing access to the canyon system through routes that didn't appear on standard military maps. Elena had discovered these paths during training exercises years ago, when she'd made it her practice to learn every possible approach to tactical objectives rather than relying solely on conventional military doctrine. "We're about 2 kilometers from the drop point," Elena announced, beginning the mental transition from driving through a storm to conducting a combat operation in conditions that would challenge even elite military units. "Time to review our approach one more time." Dylan pulled out the tactical maps they'd studied back in Millfield, though the familiar terrain features were now obscured by darkness and swirling snow that reduced visibility to mere meters. Insertion via the North Ridge, using the frozen waterfall as concealment for our descent into the canyon system. From there, we establish communication with trapped personnel and coordinate extraction using whatever vehicles or aircraft we can commandeer. Elena nodded while scanning the landscape for the landmarks that would guide them to their objective, despite the deteriorating visibility. The key is staying mobile and unpredictable. The enemy has positioned themselves to defend against conventional rescue attempts, so we're going to do everything they don't expect. She pulled the vehicle off the main road and onto a barely visible track that wound through dense pine forest toward the ridgeline overlooking Serpent's Canyon. The path was treacherous under normal conditions, made nearly impassable by ice and snow that concealed rocks and fallen trees capable of disabling their vehicle. Elena drove with the careful precision of someone who understood that mechanical failure in these conditions would likely prove fatal. "Elena," Dylan said quietly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been present during their planning session. "What if we're wrong about Reed? What if this really is just a training exercise that went bad, and we're about to compromise a legitimate military operation?" Elena brought the vehicle to a stop and turned to face Dylan directly, her expression serious but not unkind. It was a fair question, the kind of doubt that any rational person would experience before undertaking an unauthorized military operation in life-threatening conditions. "Dylan, in my 15 years of military service, I learned to distinguish between legitimate operations that encounter unexpected difficulties and situations where soldiers are being deliberately sacrificed for political purposes," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "Everything about this situation, the timing, the intelligence failures, the lack of proper preparation, Reed's response to the crisis, follows a pattern I've seen before." She gestured toward the radio equipment that continued to monitor military communications, picking up fragments of conversations that revealed the true scope of what was happening in the canyon below. "More importantly, even if we're wrong about Reed's motivations, 200 soldiers are still trapped and dying while their commanding officers debate political implications instead of launching rescue operations. Sometimes the only rational response to institutional failure is individual action." Dylan listened to Elena's explanation while watching snow accumulate on the windshield, each flake a reminder of time passing while soldiers suffered in conditions that grew more dangerous by the hour. "What happens to us if we're caught conducting an unauthorized operation?" "Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possible criminal charges depending on how the military decides to characterize our actions," Elena replied without hesitation. "But if we succeed in saving those soldiers, I can live with whatever consequences follow. If we do nothing and they die because we were afraid of getting in trouble, I'll never forgive myself." Dylan was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of Elena's words while listening to the wind howl around their vehicle like a living thing hungry for victims. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the resolve of someone who'd moved beyond doubt into commitment. "Those soldiers didn't choose to be in this situation," Dylan said. "They followed orders and trusted their leaders to make decisions that valued their lives. If their leaders have failed them, then it's up to us to fill that gap." Elena smiled with genuine warmth, recognizing in Dylan the same moral courage that had driven her own decision to risk everything for soldiers who couldn't protect themselves. "Then let's gear up and show them what real leadership looks like." They spent the next 30 minutes preparing for conditions that would test every aspect of their training and equipment. Elena's gear included specialized cold weather clothing designed for extended operations in sub-zero temperatures, climbing equipment rated for frozen waterfalls, and weapons systems that had been modified to function reliably in extreme cold. Dylan carried communication equipment that would allow them to coordinate with both the trapped soldiers and any allies who might be in position to provide support. The wind nearly knocked them off their feet when they stepped out of the vehicle, driving snow so hard that it felt like being sandblasted with ice crystals. Elena immediately activated the GPS beacon that would guide them to their insertion point, knowing that visual navigation would be impossible in these conditions. The temperature gauge on her equipment read -32 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause frostbite in exposed skin within minutes. "Stay close and watch your footing," Elena shouted over the wind, beginning the trek through knee-deep snow toward the ridgeline that overlooked their objective. "If we get separated in this weather, we might not find each other again." The hike to their insertion point took nearly 2 hours, with both Elena and Dylan struggling against wind that threatened to knock them down with every step. The cold was so intense that their breath froze instantly, forming ice crystals that accumulated on their face masks and threatened to block their vision. Elena had experienced similar conditions during Arctic training exercises, but operating in this weather while carrying full combat gear pushed the limits of human endurance. "There," Elena said, pointing toward a barely visible break in the ridgeline where a frozen waterfall provided the concealment they needed for their descent into the canyon. "That's our way down." Dylan stared at the ice-covered cliff face with a mixture of awe and terror, realizing that Elena intended to rappel down a vertical wall of frozen water in conditions that made standard climbing techniques extremely dangerous. "Are you sure this is possible?" Elena was already securing climbing anchors in the frozen rock, her movements efficient despite the numbing cold that made every task more difficult. "I've done it before in better conditions. Tonight we're going to find out if 5 years of civilian life have made me soft." The descent into Serpent's Canyon tested every skill Elena had developed during her military career, requiring her to navigate frozen waterfalls while carrying enough equipment to conduct combat operations in sub-zero temperatures. The rope fed through her rappelling device with mechanical precision, but ice accumulation threatened to jam the equipment at any moment. Below them, the canyon floor was invisible through swirling snow that concealed both obstacles and enemies. Dylan followed Elena's descent with the careful movements of someone who understood that a single mistake would result in a fatal fall onto rocks hidden beneath the snow. His breathing apparatus frosted over repeatedly, forcing him to clear ice crystals that threatened to suffocate him while maintaining his grip on frozen climbing gear. "Movement!" Elena whispered into her radio when they were halfway down the cliff face, having spotted thermal signatures through her night vision equipment. "Enemy patrol. 2 individuals, bearing northeast approximately 200 meters. Dylan froze on the rope, trying to minimize any noise or movement that might attract attention from hostiles who were patrolling the canyon perimeter despite the brutal weather conditions. Elena watched the enemy soldiers through her scope, noting their professional equipment and coordinated movement patterns that confirmed her assessment of their military training. "They're good," Elena observed quietly, "but they're not expecting anyone crazy enough to be operating in these conditions." We maintained silence and continued descent. The final 50 feet of their rappel brought them to the canyon floor, where accumulated snow provided both concealment and evidence of the fierce battle that had been raging for the past 24 hours. Shell casings and equipment debris were scattered across the frozen ground, while dark stains in the snow told the story of casualties that official reports refused to acknowledge. Elena activated her encrypted communication system and attempted to make contact with the trapped soldiers, knowing that their radio discipline would be crucial to avoiding detection by enemy forces monitoring military frequencies. "Raven calling any station. Raven calling any station." She transmitted on the frequency Major Romano had provided, using call signs that wouldn't immediately identify her as someone conducting an unauthorized operation. The response came immediately, crackling with static and barely controlled desperation. "Raven, this is Ghost 6. Where the hell did you come from? And please tell me you're not alone." Elena recognized the voice as belonging to Captain Michael Torres, one of the 118th Company commanders and a soldier she'd briefly worked with during joint training exercises. Torres was competent, experienced, and exactly the kind of officer who would keep his troops alive under impossible circumstances while waiting for rescue that might never come. "Ghost 6, I'm here with limited support conducting an unauthorized extraction operation," Elena replied, knowing that her honesty about the mission's unofficial nature would be crucial to gaining Torres's cooperation. "What's your current status?" "Raven, we've got 187 effective personnel spread across 3 defensive positions in the canyon. 12 KIA, multiple wounded, ammunition running low, medical supplies critically short. We're holding our positions, but we can't last much longer in these conditions." Elena felt the familiar weight of command settling across her shoulders as she processed Torres' situation report and began formulating tactical options that could save the remaining soldiers. The numbers were worse than initial reports had indicated, with enemy fire and harsh weather combining to create casualties that would mount rapidly without immediate intervention. "Ghost 6, I need detailed information about enemy positions, your defensive capabilities, and any assets you might have available for coordinated action." Elena transmitted while scanning the canyon walls for optimal firing positions. Torres responded with the crisp professionalism of an officer who understood that their survival might depend on precise communication and tactical coordination. "Enemy forces estimated at 60 to 80 personnel with advanced weaponry and night vision capabilities. They've established overlapping fields of fire that cover all the obvious escape routes, but they seem to be avoiding close-range engagement due to weather conditions." Elena studied the tactical situation through her night vision equipment, identifying enemy positions that Torres had described while noting opportunities that might be exploited by someone willing to operate outside conventional military doctrine. "Any vehicles or aircraft available?" Elena asked, knowing that extraction of nearly 200 soldiers would require transportation assets that weren't immediately visible. Negative on aircraft. Weather has everything grounded, Torres replied. We've got 6 vehicles operational, but they're pinned down by enemy fire and won't be much use unless we can suppress the hostile positions. Elena looked at Dylan, who was monitoring enemy radio traffic and providing real-time intelligence about hostile movements and capabilities. The situation was even more complex than their initial assessment had indicated, with professional enemy forces maintaining disciplined positions despite weather that was affecting their operational effectiveness. Dylan, what are you picking up from enemy communications? Elena asked, needing to understand her opponent's capabilities and intentions before committing to any tactical action. Dylan consulted his intercept equipment, translating fragments of conversation that revealed crucial information about their adversaries, training and equipment. They're definitely military trained, possibly special operations, using encryption and tactical procedures that suggest significant funding and professional leadership. But they're also complaining about the cold and discussing whether to maintain their positions or pull back to more sheltered locations. Elena processed this intelligence while formulating a plan that would exploit the enemy's weather-related vulnerabilities while avoiding their prepared defensive positions. The storm that made conditions so miserable for everyone involved might also provide the tactical advantage she needed to extract nearly 200 soldiers from what appeared to be an impossible situation. Ghost 6, I'm going to need you to coordinate your personnel for a fighting withdrawal, Elena transmitted, knowing that her plan would require precise timing and absolute trust from soldiers who had no reason to believe that unauthorized rescue was possible. Raven, with respect, I've got responsibility for 187 soldiers who are depending on me to keep them alive, Torres replied. I need to know exactly what you're planning before I risk their lives on an operation that isn't officially authorized. Elena understood Torres's caution, recognizing the impossible position of an officer who had to balance hope for rescue against responsibility for soldiers under his command. Her response would have to demonstrate both tactical competence and emotional understanding of what these trapped soldiers were experiencing. Ghost 6. 5 years ago, I was relieved of command for caring too much about the soldiers under my authority. Elena transmitted, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience and hard-earned wisdom. Tonight, I'm going to prove that caring too much is exactly what your people need to get home alive. Elena crouched behind a snow-covered boulder at the canyon's edge, watching enemy positions through her thermal scope while calculating angles of fire and timing windows that would determine whether 187 soldiers lived or died in the next few hours. The storm had intensified beyond even her optimistic projections, creating whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to mere feet, while generating wind patterns that would mask the sound of movement and gunfire. These were exactly the conditions she needed to accomplish something that military doctrine considered impossible. Ghost 6. I need you to listen carefully because we're only going to get one chance at this. Elena transmitted on the encrypted frequency, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had led soldiers through similarly desperate situations. In exactly 12 minutes, I'm going to create a diversion at the north end of the canyon that will draw enemy attention away from your positions. When that happens, you'll have a narrow window to move your wounded and non-combat personnel toward the extraction point. Captain Torres responded immediately, his voice tight with the stress of command decisions that balanced hope against the harsh reality of their tactical situation. Raven, I appreciate whatever help you can provide, but 12 minutes isn't enough time to move nearly 200 people across hostile terrain in these weather conditions. Elena adjusted her position to get a clearer view of the enemy's defensive arrangements, noting the professional spacing and overlapping fields of fire that confirmed these weren't amateur fighters but trained military personnel with sophisticated equipment and tactical knowledge. Go 6, you're not going to move everyone at once. We're going to execute a staged withdrawal that gets your most vulnerable personnel to safety first, then gradually extract the rest while maintaining defensive positions. Dylan monitored enemy communications from his concealed position 30 meters away, translating intercepted radio traffic that revealed crucial information about their opponents, current status, and operational planning. Elena, they're discussing shift changes for their perimeter guards. Sounds like they're rotating personnel every 2 hours to prevent frostbite, which means they're not immune to these weather conditions. Elena processed this intelligence while finalizing her tactical approach, recognizing opportunities in the enemy's need to protect their own people from the brutal cold that was affecting everyone in the canyon. Professional soldiers or not, human beings had physical limitations that could be exploited by someone willing to operate beyond normal endurance parameters. Dylan, I need you to work your way around to the east side of the canyon and establish overwatch on the enemy's secondary positions, Elena instructed, knowing that her plan would require coordination between multiple firing positions to succeed. When I initiate contact at the north end, they're going to try to flank our positions from that direction. Dylan shouldered his rifle and began moving through the snow-covered terrain with the careful precision of someone who understood that a single misstep might compromise their entire operation. Elena watched him disappear into the swirling snow, then turned her attention back to the enemy positions that stood between the trapped soldiers and their freedom. The next phase of her plan required something that went against every instinct developed during 15 years of military training. She was going to announce her presence to a superior enemy force and challenge them to a direct confrontation under conditions that should have guaranteed her death. Elena had succeeded in similar situations before, but never alone and never in weather that made survival marginal even without armed opposition. Elena activated her tactical radio and switched to a frequency that she knew the enemy forces were monitoring, preparing to do something that would either save 187 soldiers or get everyone killed in the next few minutes. Attention hostile forces in Serpent's Canyon. Elena transmitted in clear, unencrypted communication that would be audible to both enemy fighters and trapped American soldiers. This is Captain Elena Vasquez, United States Army, conducting authorized extraction operations for personnel under my command. You have 60 seconds to withdraw from your positions before I demonstrate why caring about soldiers' lives makes someone dangerous rather than weak. The response was immediate and predictable, with enemy radio traffic exploding into activity as commanders tried to identify the source of Elena's transmission while coordinating defensive measures against a threat they couldn't locate or quantify. Elena smiled grimly as she listened to their confusion, knowing that uncertainty was often more valuable than superior firepower in tactical situations. Ghost 6, did you copy my transmission? Elena asked Captain Torres, needing to ensure that the trapped soldiers understood what was about to happen and could coordinate their actions accordingly. Raven, I copied, but I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish by announcing your presence to enemy forces, Torres replied, his confusion evident in his voice. They're going to concentrate their fire on your position. Exactly, Elena said, beginning her movement toward the enemy's primary defensive cluster at the canyon's narrow northern entrance. They're going to focus their attention on eliminating the threat they can identify, which will give you opportunities to move personnel and establish better defensive positions. Elena's approach to the enemy positions required her to traverse open ground that offered minimal concealment, relying on the storm's intensity and her knowledge of human psychology to avoid detection until she was ready to initiate contact. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to become invisible in hostile terrain, each step calculated to minimize noise and visual signature despite the challenging conditions. The first enemy position contained 3 soldiers equipped with advanced night vision gear and automatic weapons, positioned to provide overlapping coverage of the main canyon approach. Elena observed their routine through her scope, noting the way they shifted positions to stay warm, and the communication patterns that revealed their level of training and discipline. Elena activated the timer on her tactical watch and began the sequence of actions that would either demonstrate the power of emotional leadership or result in her death in an unmarked canyon in the Montana wilderness. She removed 2 flashbang grenades from her equipment vest and positioned them for maximum psychological impact rather than maximum casualties. Dylan, initiate overwatch in 30 seconds. Elena transmitted, knowing that her partner would need to be ready to provide covering fire once the enemy realized they were facing a coordinated attack rather than a single desperate individual. Elena's first shots were carefully placed to disable equipment rather than kill personnel, targeting communication gear and night vision systems that would reduce the enemy's tactical effectiveness without creating the kind of casualties that might provoke a no-quarter response. The suppressed rifle made almost no sound in the howling wind, but the effects were immediate as enemy positions lost their technological advantages. The flashbang grenades detonated simultaneously at opposite ends of the enemy's defensive line, creating confusion and temporary blindness that Elena exploited to advance to a new firing position before they could coordinate a response. She continued her methodical destruction of enemy equipment, using precision fire to eliminate their advantages while avoiding direct confrontation with superior numbers. Contact north! Contact north! The enemy radio traffic revealed their growing panic as they tried to respond to an attack they couldn't locate or understand. Elena's tactics were so far outside conventional military doctrine that trained soldiers didn't know how to counter them effectively. Dylan's rifle spoke from the eastern ridge, his shots carefully coordinated with Elena's movement to create the impression of a much larger attacking force. Enemy soldiers began falling back from their forward positions, seeking cover from threats they couldn't identify while trying to maintain their defensive responsibilities. Ghost 6. Enemy positions are compromised. Repeat, enemy positions are compromised. Elena transmitted while advancing to her next firing position. Begin movement of wounded personnel to Extraction Point Alpha. Captain Torres responded with the crisp professionalism of an officer who recognized a tactical opportunity when he saw one. Raven, we're moving wounded now. How long can you maintain pressure on enemy positions? Elena ejected an empty magazine and loaded fresh ammunition while calculating her remaining resources against the tactical objective she needed to accomplish. Ghost 6. I can maintain suppressive fire for approximately 20 minutes before ammunition becomes critical. Use that time to get your most vulnerable personnel clear of the kill zone. The enemy was beginning to adapt to Elena's unconventional tactics, with their commanders organizing coordinated sweeps designed to locate and eliminate the source of their problems. Elena watched their movement patterns through her thermal scope, recognizing the professional competence that made them dangerous opponents, despite their current disadvantage. Elena, they're sending a squad to flank your position from the west, Dylan reported, his voice tense with concern for Elena's safety as enemy forces began to converge on her location. 6 personnel with heavy weapons moving in tactical formation. Elena acknowledged Dylan's warning while repositioning to avoid the enemy's flanking maneuver, using the canyon's irregular terrain to break visual contact and establish a new firing position that would allow her to continue harassing their defensive efforts. Her ammunition was running lower than she'd hoped, but the psychological effect of her attack was exceeding expectations. Ghost 6. What's your status on personnel movement? Elena asked, while engaging the flanking squad with precision fire that forced them to seek cover rather than continue their advance. Raven, we've got 22 wounded personnel moving toward Extraction Point Alpha, with escort provided by 1st Squad, Torres reported. Medical supplies are critically low, but we're keeping people alive until evacuation can be completed. Elena felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from successful tactical operations, knowing that 22 soldiers were moving closer to safety because someone had been willing to risk everything for their welfare. This was why she'd become a soldier in the first place, not for strategic objectives or political goals, but for the simple moral imperative of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Dylan, I need covering fire while I reposition to maintain pressure on the enemy's eastern flank, Elena transmitted, recognizing that her current location was becoming untenable as enemy forces concentrated their search efforts. Dylan's rifle provided the suppressive fire Elena needed to move to her next position, but she could hear the strain in his voice as he tried to manage multiple enemy contacts with limited ammunition. They were both operating at the edge of their capabilities, sustained by determination and tactical skill rather than superior firepower or overwhelming support. Elena's new firing position offered better concealment but required her to engage enemy forces at longer range, testing her marksmanship skills under conditions that challenged even her extensive training. Each shot had to count, both to conserve ammunition and to maintain the psychological pressure that was keeping enemy forces disorganized and defensive. Ghost 6, I need a status update on your defensive preparations. Elena transmitted while engaging an enemy machine gun position that was threatening the movement of wounded soldiers. Are you ready to begin Phase 2 of the extraction? Captain Torres's response reflected both gratitude and growing confidence, as he realized that Elena's unconventional approach was actually succeeding against professional opposition. Raven, wounded personnel have reached Extraction Point Alpha and are being loaded into vehicles. We're ready to begin movement of non-essential personnel on your signal. Elena checked her tactical watch, calculating the time remaining before enemy reinforcements might arrive or weather conditions deteriorated beyond operational limits. Everything depended on maintaining the delicate balance between aggressive action and tactical sustainability that would allow her to extract nearly 200 soldiers without losing control of the situation. Dylan, ammunition status? Elena asked, needing to understand their remaining capabilities before committing to the next phase of her plan. "Running low," Dylan replied tersely, his voice revealing the stress of sustained combat operations under extreme conditions. "Maybe 10 minutes of sustained fire if we're careful with target selection." Elena processed this information while observing enemy movements that suggested they were beginning to understand the true size and capabilities of the force they were facing. Professional soldiers adapted quickly to tactical situations, and Elena knew that her window of opportunity was closing as they organized more effective responses to her attacks. "Ghost 6, initiate Phase 2 immediately," Elena commanded, recognizing that delay would only allow the enemy to regain their tactical balance. "Move all non-essential personnel to extraction points while we maintain suppressive fire on their positions." Elena watched through her scope as American soldiers began moving across the canyon floor in coordinated groups, using the confusion created by her attack to reach vehicles and defensive positions that would allow them to participate in their own rescue. The sight of soldiers helping soldiers, of people refusing to abandon their comrades despite personal danger, reminded Elena why she'd been willing to sacrifice her military career rather than accept preventable casualties. "Enemy forces are pulling back from forward positions," Dylan reported, his tactical assessment revealing the success of Elena's psychological warfare approach. "They're consolidating around their command post, probably preparing for a coordinated counterattack." Elena acknowledged Dylan's report while considering how to maintain pressure on enemy forces without overextending her limited resources. The enemy's withdrawal offered opportunities, but also suggested that their commanders were regaining control of the tactical situation and preparing more effective responses. "Ghost 6, what's your current status on vehicle preparation?" Elena asked, knowing that the extraction's success would ultimately depend on their ability to move nearly 200 soldiers across hostile terrain to reach safe areas. "Raven, we've got 6 vehicles operational with drivers and security teams assigned," Torres replied. "Wounded personnel are loaded and ready for immediate evacuation, but we'll need continued suppressive fire to get the vehicles past enemy positions." Elena studied the tactical situation through her thermal scope, identifying enemy positions that could threaten the vehicle convoy while calculating firing solutions that would provide the covering fire Torres needed. Her ammunition situation was becoming critical, but the extraction was entering its final phase, where every shot could determine whether soldiers lived or died. "Dylan, I need you to focus your fire on the enemy's eastern positions while I engage their command post," Elena transmitted, coordinating their remaining resources for maximum tactical effect. "We're going to give those vehicles a clear path to safety." Elena's attack on the enemy command post was designed to create maximum disruption rather than maximum casualties, using the psychological principles she'd learned during years of leading soldiers who trusted her to value their lives above tactical convenience. Her shots targeted communication equipment and leadership personnel, creating confusion that would prevent coordinated responses to the vehicle movement. "Vehicles moving! Vehicles moving!" Torres's voice carried excitement and relief as the convoy began its journey toward safety, carrying wounded soldiers and non-essential personnel away from the kill zone that had trapped them for nearly 24 hours. Elena provided covering fire for the convoy while monitoring enemy responses, noting the professional discipline that kept their defensive positions intact despite the leadership disruption she'd created. These were good soldiers fighting for the wrong cause, and Elena found herself respecting their competence even while working to defeat them. "First convoy clear of immediate danger zone," Torres reported, his voice reflecting the emotional weight of watching soldiers reach safety after hours of desperate fighting. "Preparing second convoy with remaining non-combat personnel." Elena reloaded her rifle with her last magazine, calculating the shots remaining against the tactical objectives she still needed to accomplish. The ammunition situation was becoming critical, but the extraction was succeeding beyond her most optimistic projections. Soldiers were reaching safety because someone had been willing to risk everything for their welfare, validating the emotional investment in personnel that had ended her official military career. "Dylan, ammunition critical," Elena transmitted, warning her partner that their ability to provide covering fire was approaching its limits. "How many more personnel need extraction?" Ghost 6 reports approximately 100 personnel remaining in defensive positions, Dylan replied, his own ammunition situation reflected in the increasing selectivity of his target engagement. "They're planning one final convoy with combat personnel providing security." Elena understood the tactical challenge they faced, knowing that the final extraction would be the most dangerous as enemy forces concentrated their remaining capabilities against targets they could clearly identify. Her emotional investment in these soldiers' welfare had brought them this far, but completing the mission would require her to risk everything in a final confrontation with professional opponents who were no longer confused or disorganized. Ghost 6, prepare your final convoy, Elena transmitted, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with whatever consequences might follow. We're going to get every single one of your people home alive, because that's what good soldiers do for each other. The final convoy assembled under Elena's protective fire as dawn began to break over Serpent's Canyon, revealing the full scope of the battlefield where one woman's emotional investment in soldiers' lives had turned an impossible situation into a tactical victory. Elena counted muzzle flashes from her remaining position, calculating that she had perhaps 6 shots left in her magazine and no backup ammunition to sustain the covering fire that 100 combat-ready soldiers would need to reach safety. Ghost 6, final convoy ready for movement, Captain Torres transmitted, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that would determine whether the most dangerous phase of the extraction succeeded or resulted in catastrophic casualties. We've got 97 personnel loaded into 4 vehicles with combat escorts, but we're going to need sustained, suppressive fire to clear the canyon exit. Elena adjusted her position to provide the best possible angles of fire while Dylan moved to his final overwatch location, both of them understanding that their ammunition limitations meant this last phase would succeed through precision rather than volume of fire. The enemy forces had reorganized during the convoy loading, establishing new defensive positions that covered the canyon's only viable exit route, with overlapping fields of fire. Dylan, final ammunition check, Elena requested, needing to coordinate their remaining resources for maximum tactical effectiveness during the most critical moments of the operation. 4 rounds remaining. Dylan replied, his voice reflecting the calm professionalism of someone who had accepted that success would depend on making every shot count. I can engage 4 individual targets before we're completely dependent on psychological pressure. Elena studied the enemy positions through her thermal scope, identifying the key personnel and equipment that posed the greatest threat to the final convoy's movement. Her years of experience had taught her that leadership targeting could create disproportionate effects on enemy unit cohesion, especially when conducted by someone willing to take extreme personal risks to protect soldiers under her command. Ghost 6, convoy movement in 30 seconds, Elena announced, beginning the final sequence of actions that would either complete the most successful unauthorized rescue operation in military history or result in massive casualties that would haunt her forever. Maintain vehicle spacing and maximum speed through the exit corridor. Elena's first shot eliminated an enemy sniper whose elevated position threatened the entire convoy route, the precision of her marksmanship disrupting enemy plans while conserving her critically limited ammunition. Dylan's rifle spoke simultaneously from the eastern ridge, his shot disabling a machine gun position that could have devastated the closely spaced vehicles. The convoy began moving with the coordinated precision of soldiers who understood that their survival depended on executing a plan that balanced speed with tactical discipline. Elena provided covering fire as the lead vehicles approached the most dangerous section of their route, where enemy forces had concentrated their remaining defensive capabilities. Elena's second shot targeted an enemy radio operator whose communications equipment was crucial to coordinating defensive fire against the convoy, creating confusion in their command structure at the moment when precise coordination was most essential. The psychological effect of losing key personnel was immediate, with enemy soldiers hesitating when they should have been engaging targets. Led vehicle through the corridor, Torres reported, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored the convoy's progress while coordinating defensive fire from the remaining combat personnel, taking scattered fire but maintaining speed and formation. Elena watched the convoy's progress through her scope while calculating firing solutions for her remaining ammunition, knowing that each shot represented the difference between life and death for soldiers who had trusted her emotional investment in their welfare over conventional military doctrine. Her third shot eliminated an enemy squad leader whose tactical competence was organizing effective resistance to the convoy movement. Dylan's final shots provided the precision fire that Elena needed to reposition for her last engagement, his marksmanship buying precious seconds that allowed the convoy to maintain momentum through the most dangerous section of their escape route. Elena could see the convoy vehicles accelerating towards safety, carrying soldiers whose lives had been saved by someone willing to risk everything for their welfare. Elena's final shot was aimed not at enemy personnel, but at a fuel depot that enemy forces had established to sustain their operations, creating a dramatic explosion that provided both physical and psychological cover for the convoy's final dash to safety. The fireball illuminated the canyon walls while sending a clear message about the consequences of threatening soldiers under Elena's protection. "All vehicles clear of immediate danger zone," Torres announced, his voice carrying relief and amazement at the success of an operation that should have been impossible. Convoy proceeding to secure rally point with all personnel accounted for. Elena shouldered her empty rifle and began moving toward the extraction point, her mission complete, despite operating under conditions that conventional military wisdom considered unsurvivable. Behind her, enemy forces were regrouping and attempting to pursue the convoy, but their leadership structure had been disrupted and their momentum broken by tactics they couldn't counter effectively. "Dylan, time to go," Elena transmitted, coordinating their withdrawal from positions they could no longer defend without ammunition. "Mission complete. All personnel extracted successfully." The rendezvous with the rescued soldiers took place at a secure location 20 kilometers from Serpent's Canyon, where Elena found herself surrounded by 187 soldiers whose lives had been saved by her willingness to prioritize their welfare over military politics and career safety. Captain Torres approached her with an expression that combined gratitude with professional respect for someone who had accomplished the impossible through sheer determination. "Captain Vasquez," Torres said formally, using the rank that Elena had earned through 15 years of distinguished service before being dismissed for caring too much about soldiers' lives. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. These soldiers are alive because you were willing to risk everything for people you'd never met." Elena looked around at the faces of soldiers who were warming themselves around improvised fires, receiving medical attention for their wounds, and reconnecting with comrades they'd thought they might never see again. These were the moments that made military service meaningful. Not the strategic objectives or political considerations, but the simple human connections between people who had chosen to protect each other. "Captain Torres, these soldiers are alive because they never gave up on each other," Elena replied, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who understood that successful leadership was about inspiring others rather than claiming personal credit. "You kept them together under impossible conditions, and they trusted you enough to attempt an extraction that seemed impossible." Major Catherine Romano arrived at the rally point 3 hours later, leading a convoy of official military vehicles that had been dispatched to provide medical evacuation and logistical support for the rescued personnel. Elena watched Kit approach with the mixed emotions of someone reuniting with a trusted friend under circumstances that would inevitably attract unwanted attention from military authorities. "Elena," Kit said quietly, her voice carrying years of shared experience and mutual respect. "You actually did it. You extracted 187 soldiers from a defended position in impossible weather conditions, using nothing but determination and tactical skill that officially doesn't exist." Elena smiled at her former second-in-command, remembering their years of service together and the principles that had guided their approach to military leadership. "Kit, we did what good soldiers have always done when their leaders fail them. We took care of each other." Kit's expression became serious as she pulled Elena aside for a private conversation, away from the soldiers who were being processed for medical evacuation and debriefing. "Elena, you need to understand what's going to happen now. This operation succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but it was completely unauthorized. Colonel Reed is furious, and he's demanding a full investigation into how a civilian conducted military operations without proper authorization." Elena had expected this response from Reed, understanding that her success represented a direct challenge to the military philosophy that had ended her career and nearly resulted in the deaths of 187 soldiers. "What's the official position on the rescue operation?" Officially, the 118th Mountain Infantry Division encountered unexpected difficulties during a training exercise and was successfully extracted by rapid response teams operating under adverse weather conditions. Kit replied, her voice reflecting the careful language of military bureaucracy designed to obscure inconvenient truths. "Unofficially, everyone knows that you saved those soldiers when their commanding officers had written them off as acceptable casualties." Elena processed this information while watching soldiers being loaded into medical evacuation helicopters, that would carry them to proper medical facilities where their wounds could be treated and their recovery monitored. The sight of soldiers reaching safety validated every risk she'd taken and every principle that had guided her unauthorized rescue operation. "Kit, what about the enemy forces that were responsible for the ambush?" Elena asked, knowing that professional military units didn't simply appear in American territory without significant planning and support networks. Kit's expression darkened as she consulted classified intelligence reports that revealed the scope of the conspiracy Elena had disrupted. The hostile forces were foreign military contractors working with domestic collaborators who had access to classified information about American troop movements. The investigation is ongoing, but preliminary evidence suggests that someone with high-level security clearance provided intelligence that made the ambush possible. Elena felt the familiar cold certainty that accompanied confirmation of institutional betrayal, understanding that the soldiers she'd rescued had been deliberately placed in danger by people who should have been protecting them. "Reed," she said simply, the name carrying all the contempt she felt for officers who treated soldiers as expendable resources. "We can't prove Reed's direct involvement yet, but the investigation is expanding beyond the immediate tactical situation," Kit replied. "Your rescue operation exposed a conspiracy that goes well beyond one training exercise, and there are people in Washington who are very interested in understanding how American soldiers ended up in a kill zone that required unauthorized civilian intervention to escape." Over the following weeks, Ina returned to her quiet life in Millfield, while military investigators worked to unravel the conspiracy that had nearly resulted in the deaths of 187 soldiers. The official reports classified her role in the rescue operation to protect sensitive sources and methods, but word of her actions spread through military networks, where stories of exceptional leadership were told and retold, with the reverence reserved for legendary figures. Colonel Marcus Reed's career ended abruptly when investigators discovered evidence of his collaboration with foreign military contractors, including financial records showing payments for classified information about American troop movements and training exercises. His court-martial revealed a pattern of sacrificing soldiers' lives for personal advancement, validating Elena's assessment of his character and confirming that institutional betrayal had placed good soldiers in mortal danger. The broader investigation exposed a network of corruption within military leadership that had resulted in multiple training accidents and operational casualties over several years. Elena's rescue operation had not only saved 187 soldiers, but also disrupted a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of American military operations and the safety of countless service members. Elena stood behind the counter of Mountain Edge Outfitters on a quiet Tuesday morning, 6 months after the events in Serpent's Canyon, watching snow fall past the window in patterns that reminded her of tactical movements and escape routes she preferred not to remember. The outdoor gear store had returned to its normal rhythm of serving local customers and seasonal tourists, providing Elena with the peaceful civilian life she'd built through careful planning and deliberate anonymity. The bell above the door chimed as a young woman in civilian clothes entered, moving with the particular combination of confidence and uncertainty that Elena recognized immediately as belonging to recent military academy graduates. The visitor was perhaps 24, with the kind of posture and bearing that suggested formal military training tempered by recent experiences that had challenged her faith in institutional leadership. "Are you Elena Vasquez?" the young woman asked, her voice carrying the respectful formality of someone addressing a superior officer despite the civilian setting. Elena wiped her hands on a shop towel while studying her visitor, noting the way she automatically scanned the store's layout and positioned herself to maintain visual contact with both Elena and the exit. "Depends on who's asking and why they want to know." The young woman reached into her jacket and pulled out a letter bearing official military letterhead, though Elena could see that it had been carefully folded and obviously read multiple times. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen recently resigned from active duty. Major Romano suggested I might find you here if I was looking for advice about leadership principles that prioritize soldiers' welfare over institutional politics." Elena accepted the letter and read Kit Romano's introduction, which provided enough background about Lieutenant Chen's situation to explain why she'd made the journey to Montana. Chen had been an exemplary officer whose career had been destroyed when she'd refused to follow orders that would have resulted in preventable casualties among soldiers under her command. "Lieutenant Chen, what kind of advice are you looking for?" Elena asked, gesturing toward the chairs near the window where she'd had similar conversations with other young officers whose careers had been damaged by moral courage. Sarah settled into the offered chair with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of authority figures and institutional promises. I was told that my emotional investment in soldiers' welfare made me unsuitable for command positions. My superiors said that caring too much about individual lives compromised my ability to make strategic decisions that served the greater good. Elena poured coffee from the pot she kept behind the counter, recognizing her younger self in Sarah's combination of idealism and disillusionment. "And what do you think about their assessment?" "I think they're wrong," Sarah replied without hesitation, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had paid a personal price for her principles. "I think caring about soldiers' lives is what makes leadership meaningful, and I think officers who treat people as expendable resources are the ones who shouldn't be trusted with command authority." Elena smiled with genuine warmth, hearing in Sarah's words the same moral clarity that had guided her own approach to military leadership before institutional politics had forced her into civilian life. "Sarah, you're absolutely right. Caring about the people under your command isn't a weakness. It's the most important qualification for leadership, especially when institutional pressures encourage treating soldiers as statistics rather than human beings." She gestured toward the mountains visible through the store's window, where Elena had proven 6 months ago that emotional investment in soldiers' welfare was the key to accomplishing missions that conventional military doctrine considered impossible. "The question isn't whether you care too much. The question is whether you're willing to act on that caring when institutions fail the people they're supposed to protect." Sarah leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd been searching for validation of principles that had cost her a military career. "What happens to officers like us? Where do we go when the system decides that caring about people is incompatible with effective leadership?" Elena stood and walked to a cabinet behind the counter, removing a folder that contained contact information for a network of former military officers who shared her philosophy about prioritizing soldiers' welfare over institutional politics. "Sarah, there are more of us than you might think. Officers who believe that leadership means taking care of people, that success is measured by bringing everyone home safely, that emotional investment in soldiers' lives makes us better leaders rather than weaker ones." She handed Sarah the folder, which contained information about organizations that provided support for military personnel who had been dismissed or marginalized for ethical leadership practices. "We may not wear uniforms anymore, but we're still soldiers. We still take care of each other, and we still remember that the most important mission is protecting people who can't protect themselves." Sarah opened the folder and studied the contact information with growing amazement, realizing that her forced resignation from military service didn't mean the end of her ability to serve others. "Is this what you do now? Help officers who've been pushed out for caring too much?" Elena returned to her position behind the counter, where she could see both Sarah and the street outside while maintaining the peaceful facade of civilian life that protected her ability to help others. "Sarah, 6 months ago I extracted 187 soldiers from an impossible situation, using nothing but tactical skill and emotional investment in their welfare. The operation succeeded because I cared enough about those soldiers to risk everything for their safety." She paused, allowing Sarah to process the implications of what she'd just revealed. "Now I run an outdoor equipment store in Montana, help young officers who've been dismissed for moral courage, and wait for the next time someone needs to be reminded that soldiers' lives matter more than military politics." Sarah stared at Elena with growing understanding, recognizing that she was speaking with the person whose unauthorized rescue operation had become the subject of whispered conversations throughout military circles. "You're the officer who saved the 118th Mountain Infantry Division. You're the one who proved that caring about soldiers makes someone more dangerous rather than weak." Elena smiled and began organizing inventory sheets that were already perfectly arranged, maintaining the careful balance between acknowledgement and anonymity that protected her ability to continue helping others. "Sarah, I'm someone who believes that good soldiers take care of each other, especially when institutions fail them. If you share that belief, then there's always work to do, and people who need protecting." As Sarah prepared to leave, carrying contact information that would connect her with others who shared their philosophy about leadership and moral courage, she turned back one final time. "What should I tell other officers who've been dismissed for caring too much about their soldiers?" Elena looked toward the mountains where she'd proven that emotional investment in people's lives was the most powerful weapon an officer could possess. Then back to Sarah with an expression that carried years of hard-earned wisdom. Tell them that legends aren't created by following orders that treat people as expendable resources, Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had risked everything to validate principles that institutions had rejected. Tell them that the most important battles are fought by people who refuse to accept that good soldiers are acceptable casualties. Elena returned to her inventory as Sarah walked into the Montana afternoon, carrying with her the knowledge that caring too much about soldiers' lives wasn't a career-ending weakness, but a strength that could accomplish the impossible when conventional military doctrine failed. Outside, snow continued to fall in patterns that reminded Elena of tactical movements and rescue operations, of soldiers who were alive because someone had been willing to prove that emotional leadership was exactly what desperate people needed. The encrypted phone in Elena's desk drawer remained silent, but Elena knew that somewhere, soldiers were facing impossible situations that would require someone crazy enough to care about their lives more than career safety or institutional approval. When that call came, Elena would be ready to demonstrate once again that the officer who was too emotional for command was exactly the leader those soldiers needed to survive. In the growing twilight of a Montana evening, Elena Vasquez continued her quiet watch over people who couldn't protect themselves, knowing that some promises were too important to break and some principles were too valuable to compromise. The woman who had been dismissed for caring too much had found her true calling in protecting those who needed someone willing to risk everything for their welfare, one rescued soul at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.